Right, I think it's probably time to kick off, as it is nearly 25. So for those people who have tuned in, if that's the phrase we use for a Zoom, welcome. Welcome everybody who's joining this Cambridge University Alumni Festival event, which is, as you know, carving a classical career, success in the world of classical music. I trust you're all seated comfortably at your screens with a glass of something hopefully rather delicious at your elbow. As for the next hour, we're going to be chatting to a really fabulous lineup of some of Cambridge's most distinguished musical alumni about their musical life at Cambridge and beyond. And I know we're going to be discussing how their time at the university inspired their careers. And if you're watching, hoping that maybe you too might follow in their footsteps, I'm rather hoping you'll pick up some pointers and tips and words of wisdom as we go along. Do get involved with questions. You can get some questions to us and we'll do our best to answer them if we have time. I have already jumped to the conclusion there won't be too many awkward silences though, so we'll see how many questions we can get to. I should introduce myself. I'm Katie Derham and I was an economics student at Magdalene in the late 80s. I spent much of my free time being an avid consumer of the Cambridge musical scene, normally in the audience, but also as a pretty ropey violinist at the back of the seconds and comes, and also displaying, I think, what we can only describe as an early disregard for dignity in the Cambridge University Light Entertainment Society and various Gilbert and Sullivan productions, which stood me in good stead for some of the antics that I have got up to later on in my broadcasting career. Basically, I managed to carve my classical career in the world of classical music broadcasting on Radio 3 and presenting the Proms. But my panel, well, I am delighted that they have all agreed to give this hour to you. They are pretty eminent. They need very little introduction from me, but I'll just give you a few highlights. We have two King's alumni, the conductor Sir John Eliot Gardiner, who, while at King's, founded the Monteverdi Choir, which was just the first of the ensembles he founded. The English Baroque soloists and the Orchestre Révolutionnaire et Romantique followed. He is, of course, a leading light, a pioneer of the early music scene and the recipient, I learnt today, of more gramophone awards than any other living artists. How about that for a fact? Now, just 2 years after his matriculation, along came Sir Andrew Davis to King's. He was the organ scholar from 1963. Now, his conducting career has been equally glittering. He's been music director of the Lyric Opera Chicago since the year 2000, coming to the end of his time there this year, we've just been discussing. He spends much time with the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra as well. He enjoyed a much-loved stint as chief conductor at the BBC Symphony Orchestra as well. And I have to say, is often cited as the giver of the wittiest speeches at the last night of the Proms. Lovely to see you too. Now, following on just a couple of years later, along came Sir Mark Elder to Corpus Christi as a choral scholar and bassoon player, I understand. He, like Sir Andrew, has strong links with the BBC Symphony Orchestra, the CDSO as well. He enjoyed a long stint at the English National Opera, but has become synonymous more recently with the Halle, where he's been musical director since the year 2000. And he and I have had the pleasure of making a number of BBC programmes together as well. So lovely to see you, Mark. Now, Anna Lapwood is our eyes and ears into the current musical scene at Cambridge. She's Director of Music at Pembroke College. She was the youngest ever appointed to that position. She was just 21. She's revolutionised music making there. She started a number of choirs with a particular focus on choral and organ music for young women. She's a gifted instrumentalist and a singer who often performs with Gareth Malone's ensemble Voices. And we're just going to gloss over the fact that she was an organ scholar first at Magdalene, Oxford. But that's okay. And finally, continuing the links to Pembroke, it's wonderful to have the clarinetist and Pembroke alumni Emma Johnson with us as well, one of the early winners of BBC Young Musician of the Year in 1984. That's the one I first really remember getting involved with. She was just 17 then. It meant she arrived at Pembroke as a famous fresher, goodness me, and her career has been stellar ever since, as a soloist, as a chamber musician and a composer. She's one of the biggest selling classical artists out there, and I must say she's always had the most warm and winning relationship with her audience. So what a tremendous bunch you all are. Lovely to see you all. We've got so much we could chat about. John Eliot, let's just start with you. I just want to take you back to the first time you walked into King's. You already were conducting. I gather you self-taught yourself the violin and you'd been conducting since you were 15. So when you arrived at King's, did you immediately think, right, what can I do here? I mean, what was your first impression?
Oh God, it was the college choir. I didn't really enjoy them very much. They were incredibly skilled. They were incredibly homogeneously blended. But everything emerged in one kind of amorphous style. It didn't matter whether it was Tallis or whether it was Vaughan Williams. It was all the same, really. But I was completely outside of it all. I was a history scholar, not a music scholar. I didn't read music. I read history and Arabic, and didn't belong there. I mean, Cambridge was then, the music scene in Cambridge was very cliquey. There was the Beards and Sandal Brigade, led by David Munro and Chris Hogwood, and who played endless reams of Telemann. There was the NYO crowd, who were marvelous and brilliant musicians, but I wasn't one of them. And the nearest I got to playing in NYO was in 1961, when I was 18, and I was working on an archaeological dig in Petra in Jordan, and a Bedouin showed up on a camel, and he fished into his back pocket, and out came a telegram from Ruth Railton saying, "Yes, you've been accepted in the NYO as a violinist. Would you come to Russia with us?" This was in July, and the telegram was dated April, and the tour was in May. So that's as close as I ever got to playing in the NYO. And then there was a King's Chorus Scholars who were a very, very cliquey lot, and they all just dined together and sat together and so on. They were individually absolutely charming people, collectively slightly snooty, and their noses were in the air, and they sort of sang, as far as Lieder is concerned, well, they didn't sing Lieder. If you sang Schubert or Brahms, they were most surprised. They sang an awful lot of Ivor Gurney and Peter Warlock, sort of English cowpat stuff. And then there was this, Andrew's throwing his hands up in the air. There was also Raymond Leppard singing Monteverdi madrigals very politely in a punt with adoring followers. I didn't fit with any of that, and was very kind of enthusiastic. And I played in Cums, and I became conductor of Cums 2 Orchestra, which was fun. And I founded revived a thing called the Cambridge University String Players with Andrew. We did concerts together, and Andrew, bless his heart, played organ, I think harpsichord for me in my first performance, which was of the Monteverdi Vespers on the 5th of March 1964. And that was a kind of big watershed for me, because we had a wonderful man called Sir Edmund Leach, who became Provost of King's, and he was a social anthropologist, and he said, "John Eliot, you've got to sort yourself out. What are you going to do? Are you going to be an academic? Are you going to be a farmer? Are you going to be an Arabist? Are you going to be a musician? If so, what? I'll give you a year to find out." So I got an extra year, which was very generous at the college. And in that year, I decided to set myself this absurd, when looking back on it, absurdly difficult task of performing the Monteverdi Vespers, which was a work not known at all in those days and incredibly difficult to put together. And I put together a choir, mostly from chorus scholars of the Trinity, King's and Clare and St. John's, and scoured the country for cornets and sackbuts and found them, and did everything from putting out the seats to getting the stuff printed and so on. And thank God it wasn't recorded, because I'd held my head in shame if I'd heard it. But it was a kind of epiphany for me, because I realized that this was the music I really wanted to do, and I did want to become a musician. And I'm enormously grateful to the musicians who took part in that and had gave me their trust, and particularly to Thurston Dart, who was professor of music then, who really supported me, and George Malcolm, who was a wonderful person. He was then director of Westminster Cathedral choir, and he had a totally different sound, totally different from that of King's and the Oxbridge sound. It was much more passionate and much more multicolored, and I sort of tried to emulate that. And he came to the performance and encouraged me. So that, in a nutshell, was the start for me.
Let me bring in Andrew Davis. Andrew, you've already had a name check from John Eliot there. I mean, he describes as rather, he described a hilarious musical scene. Did it sound familiar? That sort of the snooty.
Well, yes. I mean, he did a pretty good destruction job on everything that was going on in Cambridge at the time. And what's all this about poo-pooing Ivor Gurney. I mean, it really won't do. But anyway, well, I first came to Cambridge in I guess 1962 in the summer. I think it was in August for the organ scholarship trials, and that was my first. I'd never been to Cambridge. I'd never heard King's College Choir live, and actually, I remember the anthem at Evensong was Parry's "I was glad." I was glad when they said unto me, except this was my first exposure to King's College Cambridge Choir's vowels. So it was big in organ introduction, the choir comes in, I was glad when they said, and you know, John Eliot was rather rude about the King's College Choir, but and I completely understand his criticism because it was a very distinctive sound and didn't change a lot. But I must say, I spent 4 years with David Wilcox, and I learned an enormous amount from him. He was a real stickler, and you know, I remember we had one choir practice, and I can't. It was my first or second year because I overlapped with John Langdon, who was my predecessor. So anyway, we in a practice for Evensong, I made one howler of the wrong chord. Fortunately, this wasn't in the service. And I saw him afterwards, and I said, "I'm sorry, David. I really, that's a terrible clangor." He said, "It's quite all right. It happens once." No, sorry, it happens to everybody once. But Cambridge for me was fascinating, and I have to say, just going back. That performance of the Monteverdi Vespers, and I'd be interested to hear a recording of it too, but I think it was absolutely remarkable. And there were endless rehearsals, I must say. John Eliot was totally indefatigable, and it was fascinating to be involved, especially in the choir rehearsals. And he brought something so completely new and fresh, and you know, it was remarkable. And there was a 50th anniversary performance that, alas, I couldn't go to because I was in Chicago opening La Clemenza di Tito. But that, you know, it was an extraordinary moment that launched, of course, a very extraordinary career. And John Eliot knows I'm a huge fan of his. We actually, after Cambridge, I went to study with Franco Ferrara in Rome for a year, and he was already in Paris studying with Nadia Boulanger, and I had to come back sort of in February in the middle of my time there it was actually to earn some money. I played organ continuo for some Handel Concerti Grossi recordings with the Academy of St. Martin in the Fields, and so I did it by train, and I stopped with John Eliot in Paris for a day or two, and we had a lovely time. So you know, there were very nice memories. Cambridge was, for me, very busy. I mean, we had services almost every day in King's. And David Wilcox would be away quite a lot, doing other things, Bach choir and various other things that he was associated with. But also, I sort of started conducting by accident in the sense that somebody was putting together a concert, and I think it was a Haydn Divertimento, and they decided they needed a conductor, and I asked me if I'd like to do it. And I did, and I thought, oh, this is sort of interesting. I quite like this. Anyway, then I did some conducting courses with George Hurst, who was a fantastic teacher, actually. Just a couple of summer 2-week courses. And then I started, I mean, there were all sorts of things going on. David Atherton was also there at the same time with us, and he was a great organizer. So in addition to Comes, he organized a sort of chamber orchestra, and he and I did quite a few concerts together with him playing the piano and me conducting, vice versa. So I think in some ways I spread myself rather thin. It was, it was tough. But then David Wilcox, who was also conductor of the Comes Orchestra, said to me, Andrew, would you like to conduct a piece in one of the concerts next year? And I said, well, of course, I'd love to. Oh, absolutely. And he said, well, I'd like you to conduct the Schoenberg 5 pieces for orchestra. And it's like, you are kidding me. But, you know, and so I did. And it was the first big orchestral piece I ever conducted in my life. You know, what a way to start. But the thing is, you know, you're young and you don't really realise how hard this is. So, and then I think the second piece I ever conducted with the symphony orchestra was Harold in Italy. So it was with a wonderful, wonderful bureau player called Ralph Aldridge, who was actually a New Zealander, but ended up in Canada. So I actually, when I was in Toronto, I saw him quite a lot. But anyway, and then, yeah, then I went on to study in Rome for a year, and I came back and did all sorts of things. I was the assistant organist to Martindale Sidwell at Hampstead Parish Church and St Clement Danes, and I proofread for shots. Actually, that was I proofread the orchestral parts for Tippett's third opera, The Knot Gone. And these were the worst parts you've ever seen in your life. They must have, and of course, everything was done by hand then. I mean, these were all hand parts. And I remember that, so I had to sort of use whiteout to correct them. I mean, this is sort of all incredibly antediluvian, this sort of thing. But, and I sent a lot of them back. I said, I can't fix these, nobody can play them. So, you know how they solved the problem? They fired me as a proofreader. But and then I took part with John Eliot actually in a seminar for young British conductors in Liverpool, with the Liverpool film. That was in 1969, I think, because we all stayed up one night and watched the moon landing.
We did.
So, you know, those were happy times. And then I actually got the post of assistant conductor with the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra, and that happened because a very good friend of mine, Glyn Bragg, who I don't know, John, I'm sure you remember Glyn. He'd become the timpanist in the BBC Scottish, and so I called him and said, I've made an application for this job. I haven't heard anything. Is there any way you can find out, you know? So he went to the office of the lady who was dealing with all the applications, and she was out. It was lunchtime. She was out of the office, and there were 3 piles. There was a yes pile, people that were definitely going to get auditions. There was a no pile, and there was a maybe pile. And I was in the maybe pile, and Glyn took my application and took it and put it in the yes pile. So I always tell him I blame him for everything that happened to me ever since.
What a fraud.
That is quite the admission, Andrew, I have to say. But good old Glyn.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Mark, let's hear what your impressions were, because obviously you went up as a choral scholar to Corpus, didn't you? And did it take long before you stood out in front?
Well, yes, my memories and my experiences are rather different from John Eliot and Andrew, just by a few years. But it's interesting that the 2 performances that Andrew mentioned, the Schoenberg 5 pieces and Harold in Italy, I played in them.
Really?
I was in them. That's how I first saw you conduct. And
How was it, Mark? How was he? Can you remember?
Totally brilliant, and I had complete confidence in him. Absolutely. And I tried those Schoenberg pieces a few years ago, and they're bloody hard. No, we did a lot of concerts together. And it's interesting that I was just a couple of years behind, but on the same sort of trajectory. I also went to the Liverpool Philharmonic thing, but a couple of years later. And it was a very, very good scheme that Charles Groves had invented. Not a competition, just to get young conductors in front of the orchestra and help them get over the experience, you know, the fear and everything. It was wonderful. But Cambridge was for me, was a slightly different journey, because I came with my voice and my bassoon, and I hadn't really conducted anything. I think I'd conducted at school. It's a terrible thing to admit this, but the first thing I ever conducted in a performance was the funeral music that Pindemit wrote for one of our last kings. He wrote it overnight after he heard that the king had died, and it was for viola and strings. And that's the first thing I ever conducted at school. So I wasn't, on my way at all with that. I was scraping reeds still. And my first year was difficult. I wasn't very happy, but I don't think that's so unusual in trying to find a way to cope with the tripos, which Andrew hasn't mentioned, but I didn't feel that I was going to be happy studying music in the way you needed to do it there. And I saw with horror that in the second year, there was a compulsory acoustics paper. And that was something, do you remember that, Andrew? And that was something that I felt I had no interest in, or no, I mean, of course, I'm incredibly interested in the science of it, but physics and all that, you know. And you had to compose a great deal. And I was able to do very good beginnings to pieces and quite good on the last few bars, but I couldn't really do the bit in the middle. And so the whole academic stuff of music was really outside my confidence. I don't think I was really good enough. I remember meeting a friend of mine, a very old friend of mine, in the library one day. And I said, "Oh, Robert, what are you doing here?" And he said, well, I've just written a long essay on Wagner's Tristan and Isolde. So I thought I ought to come in and look at the score." And it was a bit like that. It was a bit, you know, the academic sort of blinkered thing. So I needed something else. So I did a lot of acting. I did a great deal of acting all the time I was there. And I felt that conducting was something that was growing inside me. And I think the thing that for me was incredibly important was the sense of time that I had. I knew nothing about music. I remember one week listening to all the Mahler symphonies, a different one each day. I'd never heard them before. In my first, I mean, Andrew's absolutely right to say that David Atherton was around as much as he was. And that for me was an incredible inspiration to see these two fantastic musicians at work. And my first job, I think, at Cambridge was playing in Ariadne, because Atherton did the Cambridge University Opera Society. And I was just asked to whether or not I'd come and play in Ariadne auf Naxos by Richard Strauss. And I wasn't sure where Ariadne was or what FON meant, or certainly had no idea who Naxos was. I now know they're a recording company. But playing in that Ariadne was for me absolutely crucial in awakening me to the power of opera and the sort of music that Strauss was a master at. I'd never heard it. I'd no idea. Watching the singers, watching David coach the singers, and his other two operas, I was much more part of the whole structure of it. I played the piano at the rehearsals as well as the bassoon. I assisted David. We got to know each other really well. And I watched the process of putting on an opera. And of course, I had no idea how this would mean so much to me as the years went by. But my love affair with opera really started then in those circumstances. And I used to go to Covent Garden as a friend, as a junior friend, to see whatever I could. So that was vital. And the bassoon sort of disappeared. My lip went, and I really didn't practice, and I sold it. And there was a man who became a very great friend of mine called John Green, who was a clarinetist. And he had stopped being part of Cambridge's musical life, but he and I hit it off. And he came to me at the end of my first year and he said, "Andrew and David are going. There's nobody who's going to conduct here. We'll need another conductor. I think you could do it. I think you should do it." And I owe John, really very honestly, the energy and the support to get me going. And we all need that, don't we, at the beginning of our career? We need people just to encourage us, to push us out of the nest, to help us when we fall. And John came back and played in the orchestra again. He hadn't played for some time. And he helped me put the whole thing together. And as Andrew's mentioned, it's not just organizing the music, you know, and getting a soloist for a concert, but it's actually going from college to college at 10 in the morning, making sure the orchestra is out of bed. Because if you just turned up at 10:30 for a rehearsal and they were all still, you know, having hangovers from the night before, you wouldn't get an orchestra. I remember doing that quite regularly. And the experience that I had there in Cambridge was, I was so grateful, can I say this? I was so grateful that the faculty was so badly run. That the professor of music was this wonderful man called Robin Orr. Okay, Professor Robin Orr is very Scottish, very tall and very agreeable man. And he was a gourmet, I think, and a composer. Probably in that order, I'm not sure. But I'm not sure how serious he was about being the professor of music at Cambridge. I remember going for a meeting with him about conducting operas in Cambridge, and it was about 11:30. And he said, "Don't you think it's about time for sherry, for the first sherry?" I was with my great friend David Pountney. And he disappeared and came back a few minutes later with, I mean, this is a glass of water, but it was full of sherry. at 11:30 in the morning. And he was totally unperturbed by it, and he assumed we'd be fine about it too. So I met many characters at Cambridge, and I was given the opportunity to get on the podium and try and see what it felt like. And what I can say, if people, I'm thinking of the people now at Cambridge who are wondering about this sort of career, is that you of course, you know nothing. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know how to take a rehearsal. You don't know how to get inside the music. And I remember feeling completely inadequate, but also feeling that I really wanted to be there and I belonged there. I felt fine about being there, having just been a player. And that's a moment, isn't it, for all young conductors, to put aside the instrumental part of their background and try a new path. And I shall never, never forget how that helped. And I'm sure that my two friends would agree. That it's such a moment of where you have to stand alone and to make the distinction between being solitary and lonely and understanding the difference. I think that's very important. And I learned this very early on because my first concert that I ever did had the Lieder eines fahrenden Gesellen and Beethoven's Fourth Symphony. I rather liked that. You know, I didn't know all the others, but I had listened to that one and I thought we ought to do that. So we did it with the music club. And I can't remember how big the orchestra was. I just remember that there were 3 double basses. And this was in my second year, remember, when acoustics featured regularly. The lectures, as I remember, this is slightly ungenerous of me, was given by a lady who was apparently deaf. And she'd also written a book. And so when it came to the exam, I can't remember whether I wrote home to my mother or something like that, but I had nothing to say. I couldn't answer any of the questions because I'd been organizing this concert. And the point of the story is that in those 3 double basses, and the double bass part is very demanding, it's very lively, and the last movement is very fast. There was a wonderful elder man. It wasn't an undergraduate, it was a professor called Jim Beeman or something like that. And he was having the time of his life trying to get his fingers around the last movement of the symphony. And after all this had happened, my dear friend John Green told me that he'd been the examiner for the acoustics paper. And he decided to become such a good time playing Beethoven's Fourth Symphony that he wouldn't fail me.
Tremendous. Emma Johnson, let's bring you in. Let's get a view from arriving at Pembroke as already a seasoned performer. The opportunities which we've already heard about, which are so varied at Cambridge, aren't they? There's so many opportunities. Were you able to take full advantage?
Yes, it was like a wonderful playground. I mean, I have to say, I very much was in 2 minds about whether I should come to Cambridge at all, because I already was being invited to give concerts and so on. But I went up to see the admissions tutor and he persuaded me that if I didn't come now, I would never come to Cambridge, and that it's not nearly as fun to be there if you're much older than everybody else and do it later in life. So I decided to come, and I'm so glad that I did, because of what everybody's been saying about all the amazing opportunities. I remember deciding that I wanted to put on a concert where I conducted Prokofiev's Fifth Symphony, and I played for the first time the Mozart clarinet concerto, directing from the clarinet, and that was a revelation for me, and I've done it many times since in my professional life. And Mark was saying about, in those days you had to cycle round to everybody's pigeonholes in the various colleges and book your orchestra. You had to make your own posters. You know, you really got to see the workings of how a commercial concert works. I also decided to try some jazz. It was just a great place to do that without having too much fear of being in a judged professionally. So and it's something that I've been doing a lot recently. But I put together a trio. We would play sort of Benny Goodman type numbers. We were called 2 a.m. There were 3 of us, we were called 2 a.m. But we tended to find that that meant that we always ended up being programmed in May balls at 2 in the morning, which isn't necessarily my best time to play. I also started up a wind serenade, and we played all sorts of works by Beethoven and Mozart. One time I remember deciding that Octandre by Varese would be a great piece to program in a garden party at Pembroke. I don't expect many people know it, but it's a very spiky modernist piece. The trombonist didn't turn up, so I had to cycle quickly, and he was asleep in his room, so I brought him back. And so there was a big delay before the concert started, so everybody was quite disgruntled, all standing there with their pims and so on. And then we played Varese Octandre, and I have to say that the audience went from being merely disgruntled to very cross, and it was really quite a lesson in that I suppose sometimes people are in the mood for modernism, but not always, and particularly not at garden parties at Pembroke. So I learnt my lesson there. I have to say I was actually reading English to start with. That has certainly stood me in good stead. I think anybody in the arts will tell you that it's important to be able to talk about what you do, as well as to be able to do it to a high standard, and to be a real advocate for particularly classical music, which increasingly one feels is rather falling to the bottom of the pile. It's not taught as much in schools anymore, so it's very important to be able to express in words why it's important, how beautiful it is, and so on. But I changed to music for my part 2 of my degree, and found it very, very useful, the degree. There was a lot of composition, and I've since tried composing and had a number of works performed. I also was encouraged to transcribe works and make arrangements of works, and that's been very important for me, particularly as a clarinetist, because the repertoire is I suppose smaller than, of course, if you're a pianist or so on. So it's been very good to have that background of knowing how to write for orchestra or for various and in fact recently I've been doing mini versions of things like Strauss waltzes and romantic repertoire that my Emma Johnson and friends that we play, which are suitable really for this lockdown socially distanced situation. So, and that all dates back still to my time at Cambridge. So certainly have no regrets about.
And I have to ask, did you have to take the dreaded acoustics paper as well?
Now, I don't recall the acoustics paper. I wonder if it had been ditched by the time I came along.
I think the examiner was too busy playing.
Can I just butt in about acoustics? I cannot for the life of me remember the woman. She was quite eccentric, who did the acoustics course, and in the end, someone had made in the previous year had made a series of cards with the salient points of what you needed to know. So I remember cramming that in the last week before the exam. But what was her name? Anyway, it doesn't matter. She had her relationship with the English language was quite unusual. I mean, she would describe rarefaction as a moving forward wave of going backwardsness, which I really liked, and that was typical of the way she described things. And she, at one point, she wanted to talk about something about the vocal cords, and she couldn't remember. So she said, "Well, I want to discuss the frequency of vibration of the flip flap." So the vocal cords became the flip flap. I mean, we used to go to the lecture session for a good giggle.
Sounds tremendous. And look how much you've remembered, Andrew, actually. So, you know, it worked. It worked. I mean, Emma, when you were at Cambridge, you clearly threw yourself into musical life in the city and in the university. But at the time, were you still performing on a wider stage as well?
I was, yes. I mean, I have distinct memories of trying to finish an essay in the changing rooms at the Royal Albert Hall, and of dashing off to play a concert in Vienna, actually, at one point during my first term there. So it was very hard. People used to say to me, I don't know how you fit it all in. And it was very, very hard work, but I'm so glad that I did. I'm not sure that would be allowed now as well. I think the culture has changed a little bit, but in those days they liked to have people who were, you know, good sportsmen or good musicians, actors and so on, who weren't necessarily going to get a first, but who, you know, were throwing themselves into all the other stuff.
And were your musical friends at Cambridge accepting of your rather sort of busy career as well as student life?
Yes, I've made many firm friends, and everybody really was wonderful about it. In fact, in some ways, I think it was a better environment than if I'd been at just a music college, where it might have been a lot more competitive. But everybody was extremely friendly, and I've made some wonderful contacts. A couple I know from Pembroke a few years ago even commissioned a new concerto for me to play. So just shows, you know.
That's a sign of true friendship. Well, we had a question in, actually, which is going to bring us perfectly to Anna Blackwood. The question was from Chris Hutchings, who said, he's quoting from John Eliot's comment that the music scene in the 60s at King's was very cliquey. And he says, has that changed noticeably? And if so, why? So Anna, this is the perfect moment to bring you in and say, has it changed much from the stories you're hearing from your fellow panelists?
A lot of it rings very true. The sort of running around to wake people up for rehearsals, that hasn't changed. The printing your own posters, that hasn't changed. The sort of trying to drag instruments into a building 20 minutes before a rehearsal or a concert, that's still there. I think the cliquey side of things has gone away a little bit. What's lovely now is that there's sort of a musician pub, the Maypole, and everyone goes to that pub after concerts, and you know there'll always be musicians there. So if a lonely musician wants a drink, they'll go there and find people to talk to. And I think the other big change that I've noticed, sort of listening to you talk, is that before, I think it was very much kind of the choirs of King's, John's, Trinity, Clare, and that was sort of it. But now, now that basically every college has a director of music as opposed to just having an organ scholar, actually the standard of choral singing is incredibly high within the university. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find anywhere else, certainly in England, I guess, other than Oxford, where you're hearing however many 100 people sing choral evensong at the same time on a Sunday in such a small place.
Do they all sound just the same though?
No, they don't. They're very, very different sounds. I mean, if you compare John's and King's, they're totally different, different treble lines. We've got, two girls' choirs now. Both girls' choirs sound very different as well. Then you've got Trinity, who are just absolutely impeccable for a student choir. It's hard to believe that they are a student choir when you listen to them. And the experiences that all these choirs are getting, they're singing in some of the most famous venues around the world and doing CD recordings. And what an amazing thing for people who are still studying at university to have those chances. But I guess the other, oh, sorry, John, you have.
No, it's just, isn't it the worrying thing is to wonder what these wonderful musicians, and I think it's great what you're talking, the way you're describing it, this multiplicity of different choirs and different musical activity. But I mean, I just get very concerned knowing what my freelance singers are going through at the moment under COVID. What prospects do the new generation, your generation and younger, have of forging a career in music? I mean, And is that what they want to do? And is it a feasibility? That bothers me a great deal.
Anna.
But I think one of the wonderful things, certainly at the moment, is that anyone who's singing in a choir in Cambridge is also playing in an orchestra or conducting an orchestra, organising concerts. They're getting the taste of the arts admin side of things, which actually a lot of them are wanting to go into now as they see it as a slightly more sort of predictable career path. I know someone who sort of sings the lead in every opera and is also the captain of the hockey team, and has also got the highest first in her year. And so people are getting very good, as well as Samart was saying earlier, everyone spreads themselves very thinly. And that's sort of the nature of the beast, I think, when you're going through an Oxbridge degree. It's 3 years of tough, intense action, but it's a chance for you to figure out what might work as a future potential career. So you might come in thinking that you're going to be a choral singer and then leave having discovered orchestral conducting.
How about you, Anna? I mean, when did you decide that you wanted to go down the teaching and organisation and sort of, you know, cheerleading route that you have done? Was it for a while an option for you to go into the performing side?
Yeah, so I was actually a harpist when I was at school. I was at the junior academy studying harp as my principal study and did MYO for 2-3 years. And then took up the organ relatively late, went to Magdalene and did the organ scholarship there. And as Andrew was saying, it's that thing of playing for services absolutely every day. And you make that mistake and then you're never allowed to make it again. It's a terrifying experience, but you learn a lot very, very quickly. And so I fell in love with choral music during that time, having never really experienced it before. I mean, I was so unprepared when I turned up. I'd never accompanied a choir on the organ before I went to my organ scholarship, which seems ridiculous now, and I would never recommend that to anyone else. But I left absolutely loving all of the repertoire and thought, actually, this is something that I want to explore further. I think one of the weird side effects of being an organist is people say, oh, a choral conductor is someone who used to play the organ. So there's this assumption that once you finish your organ scholarship, you're then a conductor. So I sort of applied for this job in Cambridge, ended up getting it, and had to then learn very quickly on the job how to lead a choir, because I hadn't really done that before other than stepping in for someone else. And Pembroke were absolutely fantastic and supported me every step of the way and let me make my mistakes, which I definitely needed to do in a kind of low pressure, safe environment. And it's now turned into what it is now, which is an amazing place to work and, yeah, to make music.
And are you finding that you're advising your choristers and the students you're teaching as Director of Studies Music in terms of their futures? I mean, how are you, just to John Eliot's point, are you saying, you know, have a plan B, or what's the vibe, do you think?
I'm not saying have a plan B, but now you're making me wonder if I should be saying that. I mean, so many of our performers have their hearts set on conservatoire afterwards and then to go into a performing career. And I think the thing that I do say to them is, remember that within Cambridge you might be the best, but when you go to conservatoire for a master's degree, you're suddenly up against people who have just been studying for this time and just honing their art and not having to write however many essays on acoustics. And so remember that that's going to be a shock and you're going to have to work extremely hard to catch up. I think that's more of my concern. But I think in terms of pursuing a career in the arts, I would never say to someone, don't do it just because it might be hard financially or to be the very, very best, if that's what they want to do.
I think when I'm in the position of giving masterclasses to younger players, they often have this term they use called portfolio career, and they've accepted that probably the likelihood is that they will do some solo work, but also they will probably need to play in a group, maybe work with young people, you know, just have a whole variety of stuff. It's really important to be extremely creative with your approach to music these days.
A question which we've had from Francesca Kane, which is sort of, Anna might be able to answer it, but I want to ask John as well, and just in terms of the whole subject of women's voices. The question actually for you, John Eliot, was where did you get your women's voices for your first Vespers? I mean, now you'd be able to turn to Anna's choirs, of course, but...
Yeah, that would have been a luxury, because, I mean, there was a proliferation of men's voices and I had the temerity to audition them. You know, and they were very courteous and nice about it. And it was such a different type, as Andrew was saying, it's such a different type of music from what they were used to, because Monteverdi was so unknown then. And to ask them to sing not just simply with blend and euphony, but actually with vowel color and with passion and urgency was new. The women, a few from the ladies' colleges, but some of them just came down from the Royal College and the Academy, and then there were some interesting characters who were at secretarial colleges, including Sonia Gandhi, who was a contemporary of mine, and was very musical. There were all sorts of exceptions. The point I'd love to make, and I don't know whether Mark and Andrew agree with me, is that forget about the cliqueness. I mean, I was just being a bit parodistic about the whole thing, but there was this wonderful sense of potential, of possibility and tolerance, and Emma was referring to it, that you could do it, and there wasn't a sense that I suspect is still current in our conservatories, many conservatories, which is that if you don't make it as a soloist, as a soprano soloist, and with a big wobble in your voice, that you're condemned to sing in a choir, that's some terrible failure. And similarly with orchestral musicians, that if you're not a soloist, you don't have that glitz in your career, that you'll be playing in an orchestra, and that's a defeat. I'm hoping that's gone or going, but it's still a prevalent thing, and there was none of that at Cambridge. And it wasn't until I was studying with Nadia Boulanger that I really got a strong sense of what being a musician amounted to, because she was so stern with us. I mean, so implacable. And she would say to us, you have to, when you're shaving in the morning, you have to look into yourself in the mirror and you ask yourself, in the name of whom do you do what you do? That was the way she put it. A very strong sense of vocation and having the technique to do it. And I had no technique at all when I went to her. I mean, I just had 2 years of incredibly hard work learning from her, implacable ear. And she taught me in a way that I hadn't been able to learn to do, was to learn to hear as well as to listen, to hear. I mean, she would do preposterous exercises like throwing her hands up in the air and landing them on the keyboard. That was okay. But then she would turn her hands upside down, and she would then throw her rings onto the ivories and say, what harmonics of my rings play do you hear? Which is a ridiculous question, but it was all to, I mean, she was a big tease as well as a tyrannical and inspiring teacher.
Yeah. Mark, did you feel that the big fish in a small pond syndrome that Anna was referring to from Cambridge, where you had all those wonderful opportunities that you were describing before, when you left and then you went on to further study, was it a bit of a wake-up call?
Yes, I think it was. Can I just say to Andrew before I forget, the acoustic lady, wasn't she called Jeans? Susan Jeans? I think that she wrote the book. I think that's right. Does that ring a bell?
I don't know. Susie Jeans was an organist. No, I don't. No, I don't think that was the name. But anyway.
Oh right.
But yeah.
Sorry,
it's going to become a running theme, and we'll get letters later, I expect.
No, to answer your question, Katie, I didn't. After I left Cambridge, I didn't go on to study anymore. I wanted to be an operatic musician. I wanted to get a job with an opera company and learn about how opera functions. And of course, I immediately became aware that whatever had happened at Cambridge, it was all in a cocoon, and that we all had our chance to enjoy ourselves. And that there was, as John Eliot says, a feeling that if you had enough energy and determination, you could do anything. And that, of course, you had to wait your turn as soon as you got out of Cambridge, and you had to realize that you were absolutely the bottom of the ladder. And that was sometimes frustrating, because getting one's first opportunities as a conductor after the university situation was really tough, really hard. You had to wait and be the right person at the right time, at the right place. And that's hard sometimes. And I remember, again, being very grateful for the little opportunities that came my way in those first years after Cambridge, and valuing them enormously.
And how were you able to support yourself at that time? And going back to the point we were making about young people now leaving and it being a terribly precarious career.
Well, my parents had a flat in our house, and I moved into it. And then I got a job in Australia, and so I emigrated to Australia. 11 tubes of Colgate. I was nervous that they wouldn't have Colgate. Nobody I knew had been to Australia before. So that was a very big moment.
What about Charles McGarris?
Well, while I was in Australia, we met each other, and I assisted him and came back to his company at English National Opera after I'd done 2 years in Cambridge, and worked with Charles and for Charles incredibly happily. He was the most wonderful man. But it's a question of timing and being where you need to be the person that you're asked to do the next little possibility. And it's very hard that if it doesn't come, you have to wait and be ready, you know. But the other way, of course, as John Eliot has so beautifully expressed, is that you just get on and plough your own furrow and put on your own shows. The Thomas Beecham way of, you know, founding as many orchestras as you can. Yeah. And that, of course, is a great way to get a platform and to get noticed. And it's wonderful.
And Andrew, when you went on to further study in Italy, right? And so was the atmosphere there suddenly, I mean, of course it was different from Cambridge, but what did that experience teach you?
In Glasgow? You mean with BBC Scottish?
No, I mean just as soon as you'd left Cambridge, when you went out.
Oh, well, yes. I mean, I did spend a year studying, but as I say, I did all sorts of things to make a living. And then this opportunity came to audition for the job in Scotland, and that was phenomenal.
Yeah. Because
I was 2 years there, 1970 to 1972, and I had a contract to conduct 40 programs a year, and we would record 3 programs in a week, of which maybe there were one major work would be duplicated. You know, we did some for the Scottish Home Service, but I got through an enormous amount of repertoire, and they were a wonderful orchestra. You know, I was so wet behind the ears, and they were wonderfully supportive, and some real characters. There was principal second violinist, his name was Johnny Crossan, and he was a real Glaswegian. And he, you know, we were rehearsing something, and he said to me, "Maestro, whenever you come on." And I said to the leader of the orchestra, "What did he say?" He said, "I've no idea. We've been trying to understand him for the last 20 years." But it was really a fantastic experience. And then but actually the other thing that happened to me was actually right before I started, I'd been awarded the job, but I was actually given the opportunity to conduct a concert with the BBC Symphony Orchestra, and which included the Glagolitic Mass of Janacek, which I learned in 4 days before the first rehearsal, you know, because things you do when you're young, but you wouldn't dream of doing it later on. But anyway, so, you know, it was, I had a lot of luck. And Mark is absolutely right. I mean, I think you have to wait. And then of course, the trick is if you have an opportunity to be able to take it and to make your mark, I suppose.
I had a baptism of fire, probably much worse and less productive than yours, with the BBC Northern Orchestra. I was apprentice to the BBC Northern Orchestra, and you got to conduct an overture, the overture. So I know loads of overtures, but you never got to conduct a symphony or the concerto until on a Friday one evening, I was called up and saying, "Jack Thompson is ill. Will you come do the Manchester midday concert?" And I asked what the program was, and it was Prokofiev 5 and so on. It had the Elgar Cello Concerto, and I'm ashamed to say I'd never heard, or let alone studied, the Elgar Cello Concerto, and I didn't have a score. So I had to drive to Dorchester Public Library, find a score, borrow it, learn it over the weekend, drive from Dorset all the way to Manchester for a 9 or 10 o'clock rehearsal, arrived there, was with Murray Welsh as the cellist, who was late. Now there's bugger all you can do in the cello concerto without the soloist. There aren't any sort of big ritornellos, are there? And I suddenly realized that Reggie Stead, the leader, had disappeared. And then there was a suddenly tap on my left shoulder and saying, young man, I think we'll call a break here. It's quite obvious that this young bugger doesn't know if he's asked from his elbow, so we'll call a break now. And that was it. And I felt a little bit hard done by, because I'd learned this blinking concerto, and it was all to do with the fact that Murray showed up late. But it was an incredible experience, the whole thing with the BBC Northern Orchestra, because like the BBC Scottish that you were with, they were a very hard sight-reading orchestra. They smoked all through the sessions. In fact, mutual friends of ours, Simon Carrington and Al Hume, who had been at King's with us, they were at the double bass section, and they said to me, don't address the double basses. If the principal takes his meerschaum pipe out of his mouth, you'll be in deep trouble if you do. So I couldn't even see the double basses. There was a sort of nimbus of smoke, pipe smoke, and people using the scrolls in their violins as ashtrays and so on. But by goodness, it taught one so much. Example, I mean, if you had an overture lasting 12 minutes, you'd be assigned 10 minutes rehearsal. So you couldn't play the blinking thing until the light went on. So you had to prioritize so much and just choose the really difficult nuggets of the thing, and then, you know, trust to their professionalism and their cognizance of their familiarity with these overtures. So I learned a huge amount from that.
Do you know what's happened? I knew this would happen. It feels as if we've only been chatting for 20 minutes. So actually our hour is now officially up. So for all I know, the plug may already have been pulled, but let's assume that we're still talking to our wonderful audience. And please, I hope you've enjoyed it. And I'm sorry if some of your questions we didn't have time to answer, but please, thank you so much to all 5 of my panelists. It's been such a treat, it really has. I hope we can have this conversation again one day. And I hope that I'm sure you have all inspired any current Cambridge musicians to keep at it. I mean, goodness me, the opportunities are just boundless. So thank you very much indeed. And goodbye, see you very soon. In a concert hall, I hope.